Welcome to Backlight, where we will be taking you behind the scenes of our investigations at Lighthouse Reports. We are an independent, investigative newsroom working with the world's leading media on stories that serve the public interest. Every month, we will be interviewing a lead contributor behind one of our recent investigations for practical insights into how these are conducted. My name is Beatriz Ramalho de Silva, and I'm a reporter at Lighthouse. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Maud Jullien, who is an editor in the Borders and Migration newsroom. Maud led two of our latest investigations into the deadly shipwreck which took the lives of over 600 people in early June who were attempting to reach Europe from Libya. The first investigation, Drowning in Lies, uncovered how the Greek Coast Guard tampered with official statements in the aftermath of the shipwreck, concealing their own role in the disaster. Survivors said the boat capsized shortly after the Coast Guard attempted to tow it, but not only did Greek Coast Guards try to hide this, they also pressured survivors into naming certain people as smugglers. The follow-up investigation, Smuggler, Warlord, EU Ally, reveals how the lead smugglers behind the pilot's shipwreck are actually closely linked to General Khalifa Haftar, the Libyan warlord who EU leaders are currently partnering with to curb migration. Hey Maud, it's great to have you here.
Hey Beatrice, glad to be here.
I wanted to start out by asking you how the team was able to access the documents which ended up revealing that the Greek Coast Guard had changed people's official witness statements, and how did you guys go about analyzing these?
So we got them through a confidential source, and this is an investigation that we had to do really quickly. We had just about 2 weeks, if I remember correctly. We wanted it to go out shortly after the shipwreck. And what happened is we only obtained those court documents. They were difficult to get about 2 days before publication. And then we very quickly realized that they would be our key finding because they contained tangible evidence that Greek officials were trying to cover up what really happened. Before we found those documents, we had spoken to 17 survivors of the wreck, and their account of the events didn't match with the official version. They said that they had been towed by a Greek Coast Guard boat. They said that the boat was trying to take them out of the Greek search and rescue zone and that this caused them to capsize. But the official version of events made no mention of this at all. And then basically when we got these court documents, we had proof basically that the Greek Coast Guards were making efforts to cover up what really happened. And so that added a lot of credibility to the version of the survivors. And so what we did is we analyzed the answers of the survivors in the documents. I mean, it appeared very, very quickly when we started reading the testimonies that many of the answers that they gave to certain questions were completely identical. So entire chunks of answers were identical. And of course, these were answers to really crucial questions like how did the boat capsize and who were the smugglers in charge.
In the follow-up investigation to this one, you found that the key smugglers behind the shipwreck were people linked to Libyan warlord Haftar. So how did the team go about verifying the identity of those who were actually responsible for boarding people onto the boat that sank and their links to Haftar, who is now involved in EU negotiations on migration?
So there were 3 key parts to this. The interviews that I mentioned before that we did with survivors. Then we made efforts to find some of the smugglers that organized the trip to Greece. And we had journalists in the team with insider sources in Libya. It emerged very early on from the interviews that we did with the passengers on the circumstances of the shipwreck that the real masterminds of the operation were not on board the boat. But most of them didn't know who were the actual people in charge. We basically had a breakthrough when we went back to one of the survivors. And he basically described how one of the lead smugglers visited the safe house that he was staying with in eastern Libya, and that this person described the whole network behind the operation. And he mentioned a name, which was also mentioned by one of our insider sources that I mentioned earlier, and also by a low-level smuggler. So we had 3 people mentioning this one name. And the survivor gave a lot of detail on this person's role. He said that this person had the necessary connections to make sure that the radars would be turned off when the ship left the harbor in Libya. And the person that was named by the three sources is a Navy officer. So there were no questions as to his links with the government in eastern Libya in Benghazi.
To find out more about our investigative journalism and how to get involved, do subscribe to our newsletter. You can do this on our website, lighthousereports.com. Overall, what would you say were the biggest challenges throughout the course of reporting on both of these stories?
The challenges for the first investigation were turning the whole story around on a very short deadline and making sure that all of the media partners were on the same page. This was possible because our Greek partner, Reporters United, worked really hard. Basically, the reporter that was working with us spent the whole night analyzing the documents. And then it was about making sure that we were all on the same page and that we would articulate those findings from the analysis with the interviews that we did with the survivors. And we found basically survivors that had testified to the Greek Coast Guard and confirmed basically that their answers had been tampered with. So the challenge was doing that on a really short deadline. And on the smuggler story, the challenge was that we could really only rely on witness testimony. We knew that we were never going to find a paper trail on clandestine smuggling operations. So we had to find as many credible sources as possible, and that they had to be completely unrelated to each other. And then we had to try to check their testimonies against hard, verifiable facts. That, for example, one of them mentioned a curfew on the night of departure. We were able to verify that there was a curfew on the night that they departed. And this was also basically extra evidence of the involvement of Eastern Libyan authorities, because how would 600 people have been able, or 700 people even have been able to go to the shore at night while there's a curfew without the complicity of Eastern Libya's authorities kind of across the board?
And Maud, as the EU continues to fund third countries to prevent people's departures, what do you feel are the wider implications of these findings, and have you seen any impact from these investigations so far?
I think that what these two investigations have in common is that they show the opacity of the EU's migration policies, and they show the efforts that are made to lie to the public about what's happening at EU's borders and what EU's migration policies actually are. So governments are trying to hide the fact that Greek coast guards are responsible for the death of around 600 people, including women and children. They don't want people to know how deadly the current anti-immigration policies are. And they also don't want the public to know that the 9 survivors of that shipwreck that are currently charged with smuggling are not the real people responsible for the trafficking, but that the people who actually are responsible are people who EU leaders are in business with, people who EU leaders are signing deals with and giving money to. In terms of impact, these investigations and many others from other international media organizations and Greek media outlets into the Pylos shipwreck have been discussed at the EU leadership level. I think that these investigations make it more difficult for governments to ignore the facts, for governments to lie to the public. And there's been condemnation as a result of these investigations, but so far this hasn't led to any actual actions to stop human rights abuses by the Greek Coast Guard.
Thank you so much, Maud, for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. This investigation was published with El País, The Times, Siraj, Der Spiegel, Tagesschau, and Reporters United. Visit lighthousereports.com to read more about our investigation. You can follow us on Twitter @LHReports.